Before we descend into the shadows of this operation, if you are fascinated by the hidden world of intelligence and the operations that shape history from the dark, make sure to hit that subscribe button right now. Don't miss out on the files the world wasn't supposed to see. The discovery began not with a bang, but with a vibration, a seismic anomaly that shouldn't have been there. In the cool, fluorescent-lit sub-basement of a building in northern Tel Aviv, a geological analyst named Yael was staring at a monitor that displayed the subterranean heartbeat of the northern border. For years, the focus had been on the metro, the modern, concrete-reinforced tunnels that militants dug to move weaponry and personnel unseen. Israel had developed sophisticated sensors to hear the grinding of drills and the hum of ventilation fans. But what Yael saw on her screen at 03R was different. It wasn't the rhythmic mechanical noise of excavation. It was the hollow, ghostly resonance of air moving through spaces that already existed. It was the sound of a void being reopened. The data came from a sector thought to be solid bedrock, a ridge of limestone running beneath the border demarcation line, historically irrelevant to military planners. But the sensors, upgraded with new algorithms designed to filter out background tectonic noise, were picking up distinct footfalls, not the heavy, hurried steps of soldiers, but the careful, measured pacing of engineers. "They aren't digging," Yael whispered to the empty room, her coffee cold beside her. "They're unlocking." By morning, the file had moved up the chain of command, landing on the desk of the Director of Operations. The intelligence assessment was grim. The anomaly aligned perfectly with a forgotten archaeological survey from the British Mandate era, referenced in dusty archives. The survey spoke of the aqueducts of the ancients, a network of Roman-era water systems and natural fissures expanded by the Ottomans, intended to move water from the Litani River toward the coastal plains. These weren't crude dirt tunnels. They were engineering marvels of stone and archways, deep enough to evade ground-penetrating radar and wide enough to move heavy ballistic equipment. If Hezbollah had found an entrance, they weren't just digging a tunnel. They were inheriting a highway that bypassed every modern sensor array the IDF had installed. The decision was made in a closed-door meeting that lasted less than 20 minutes. A military strike was ruled out. Bombing the ridge would require massive ordnance to collapse deep stone structures, potentially triggering a regional war and revealing that Israel knew about the network before it could be fully mapped. The intelligence value of knowing where the tunnel led was worth more than its immediate destruction. They needed a ghost. They needed someone to go inside, map the network, and neutralize it from within, not with explosives that would shake the ground, but with a solution that would leave the enemy wondering if the tunnels had ever been viable at all. The call went out to Caesarea, the elite division responsible for operations in hostile territory. They needed an operative who could pass not just as a tourist or a businessman, but as someone who belonged in the dust and the ruins. They needed a legend. Creating a cover identity, or a legend, is an art form. As the history of Wolfgang Lotz taught the agency, a cover must be more than a fake passport and a backstory. It must be a lived reality. The operative cannot just act the part. They must inhabit the silence between the lies. For this mission, the agency selected an operative we will call Elias. Elias was a man of quiet intensity, with the weathered face of someone who had spent years in the sun and the calloused hands of a laborer. He wasn't a young commando. He was in his late 40s, blending the physical capability of a soldier with the patience of a scholar. His profile was perfect for the legend they were about to construct. Elias would become Dr. Arios Makris, a Greek hydrologist and amateur archaeologist specializing in Ottoman-era irrigation systems. The backstory was meticulously crafted. Dr. Makris had a digital footprint that went back 15 years, academic papers planted in obscure journals, conference attendance records in Athens and Beirut, and a consultancy firm in Cyprus that had clients across the Mediterranean. The agency spent weeks refining the details, just as they had done for the operatives in the Hamas assassination in Dubai, where passports were forged with terrifying precision. Elias's documentation was flawless. But paper is easy. Psychology is hard. Elias spent a month in a safe house in the Negev desert, relearning the trade he was supposed to be an expert in. He learned to read stone. He He learned to identify the chisel marks of Roman masons versus the restoration work of the Mamluks. He learned the chemistry of groundwater and the structural integrity of limestone arches. When he spoke, he had to sound like a man who cared more about history than politics. "You are not a spy," his handler told him during the final briefing. "You are a bored, slightly arrogant academic looking for the crowning discovery of your career. You are looking for water, not weapons. If you find weapons, you are annoyed, not interested." The entry point for the operation was bold. Elias would not sneak across the border in the dead of night. He would fly into Beirut International Airport, armed with a visa and a letter of invitation from a legitimate, albeit unwitting, Lebanese Historical Preservation Society. The society believed Dr. Makris was coming to survey water tables near the ancient ruins of Tyre. The flight from Athens was short. As Elias looked out the window at the coastline of the Levant, he felt the familiar weight of the red page in his mind. The knowledge that one slip, one inconsistency in his story, would lead to a room he would never leave. He checked his pockets, a vintage notebook, a fountain pen, a pack of Greek cigarettes, and a smartphone that appeared normal but contained encryption software capable of bursting data packets to a satellite in milliseconds. He landed at 14 Waun. The humidity hit him like a physical wall. At customs, the officer lingered over his passport. Elias tapped his fingers on the counter, projecting the impatience of a man who had important rocks to look at. "Hydrology?" the officer asked, stamping the document. "History," Elias corrected, snatching the passport back with a polite but dismissive smile. The history of how civilizations survived thirst. He was in. But being in Beirut was the easy part. The tunnels of the ancients were miles south, in the restricted military zones where Hezbollah controlled the roads, the villages, and the silence. To get there, Elias would need to do what Wolfgang Lotz had done decades prior. He would have to charm the enemy. Elias established his base of operations in a small, nondescript hotel in Tyre. It was the kind of place where journalists and NGO workers stayed, providing a natural camouflage. He spent the first 3 days doing exactly what a hydrologist would do. He visited local libraries, drank tea with municipal planners, and complained loudly about the lack of accurate maps from the 1920s. This noise was calculated. He knew he was being watched. In southern Lebanon, there are no secrets, only delayed discoveries. He needed the local Hezbollah intelligence officers to categorize him as a harmless eccentric before he made his move toward the border ridge. On the 4th day, he hired a local guide and driver, a man named Walid. Walid was a chatterbox, driving a battered Mercedes that smelled of stale tobacco and pine air freshener. The intelligence dossier on Walid identified him as a low-level informant for local militias, someone who traded information for safe passage and gasoline. He was the perfect vector. Elias would feed him the legend, and Walid would feed it to the men with the guns. "We need to go closer to the ridge," Elias said, pointing to the blue line on his map, the area where Yael's sensors had picked up the anomaly. Walid shook his head, lighting a cigarette. "No, doctor, that is a closed zone. Military area. Even the goats don't go there. The Romans went there," Elias argued, feigning academic frustration. "The aqueduct feeds from the spring at the base of that ridge. If I can't survey the source, my report is useless. I have permits." "Permits from Beirut are toilet paper in the south." Walid laughed. But he was intrigued. The foreigner was persistent, and persistence usually meant money. Elias negotiated a price that was high enough to be tempting, but not so high as to be suspicious. They drove inland, the road winding through olive groves and small villages where the yellow flags of Hezbollah fluttered from every telephone pole. The atmosphere was heavy. Eyes watched from cafe terraces. Elias felt the phantom sensation of crosshairs, a reminder of the surveillance teams that had tracked Mahmoud al-Mabhouh through the hotels of Dubai. Here, the cameras were human. They reached a checkpoint 5 miles from the target zone. 2 young men with AK-47s and no uniform stopped the car. Walid spoke to them in rapid Arabic, gesturing to Elias, tapping his head to indicate the foreigner was crazy. Elias stepped out, holding a large, rolled-up map. He didn't wait to be addressed. He spread the map on the hood of the Mercedes, ignoring the guns. "Look," he said in broken but functional Arabic. pointing to a line he had drawn on the paper. "The water flows here. The Ottoman records show a cistern here. If we find it, we can prove the village has rights to this water source. It's history." The guards looked at the map, then at Elias. He wasn't acting like a spy. Spies tried to be invisible. Elias was being annoying. He was acting like a bureaucrat. "You have 1 hour," the older guard said, waving them through. "Do not go past the old mill." They drove on. As they rounded a bend, the ridge loomed above them, a spine of gray rock against the blue sky. Elias checked his watch. He didn't have 1 hour. He had forever, because he wasn't planning on leaving the way he came. "Stop here," Elias ordered. "I need to walk the gradient." He left Walid with the car, carrying his backpack which contained his survey equipment. In reality, the backpack held a condensed laser mapper, a set of fiber optic cameras, and a device the size of a soda can that could interface with the agency's satellite network. He climbed the slope, moving through the scrub brush. He wasn't looking for a cistern. He was looking for a ventilation shaft. The ancient engineers knew that underground water needed air to flow without stagnation. They built vertical shafts every few hundred meters. If Hezbollah was using the tunnels, they would have had to clear these shafts for air or seal them to hide the light. Elias found it 20 minutes later, a cluster of rocks that looked too arranged. He knelt, brushing away the dirt. Cool air kissed his face. It smelled of damp earth and something else, the faint, metallic tang of gun oil. He had found the door to the underworld. Elias waited for the sun to dip lower, casting long shadows across the valley. He radioed Walid, telling him he had twisted his ankle and would be slow returning. It was a lie to buy time. He knew Walid would eventually drive off or call the guards. But by then, Elias intended to be a ghost. He removed a small, high-torque winch from his pack and secured it to a sturdy olive tree root. The shaft was narrow, barely wide enough for a man's shoulders. He slipped into a dark, lightweight coverall, checking his gear. No weapons. If he were caught with a gun, he was a combatant. If he were caught with only cameras and maps, he was still just a trespassing scientist. A leverageable hostage, perhaps, but not an immediate target for execution. He lowered himself into the darkness. The stone scraped against his chest and back. He descended 10 meters, then 20. The air grew cooler. Finally, his boots touched solid ground. He activated his night vision goggles. The world turned into a crisp, green phosphor landscape. He wasn't in a rough cavern. He was standing in a cathedral of engineering. The tunnel was 4 meters wide, arched with perfectly cut limestone blocks. The floor was smooth, grooved by the water that had once flowed here for centuries. But superimposed over the ancient history was the modern threat. Strung along the ceiling were fresh black cables, power lines, and fiber optics. Bolted to the Roman walls were modern brackets holding LED strip lights, currently off. Elias moved silently, his boots wrapped in sound-dampening fabric. He began his mapping protocol. The laser scanner on his shoulder spun silently, capturing millions of data points, building a 3D model of the tunnel that was being transmitted in bursts to the encrypted drive in his pocket. He walked north, toward the border. The tunnel was vast. It wasn't just a passage, it was a staging ground. In alcoves where Roman workers had once rested, he saw crates. He didn't need to open them to know what they were. The markings were in Farsi and Russian, anti-tank missiles, rocket-propelled grenades, and further ahead, something more disturbing. He saw heavy machinery, drilling equipment that was silent now. They were widening the tunnel, expanding the ancient arteries to accommodate vehicles. The implications were terrifying. Hezbollah wasn't just planning to infiltrate squads of fighters. They were preparing to drive jeeps and mobile launchers directly under the border defenses. He needed to get deeper. He needed to find the choke point, the structural keystone that, if compromised, would bring the whole system down without the seismic signature of a massive explosion. As he moved, he heard a sound. Not the ghost sound from the sensors, but a real voice. Echoing. Coming from ahead. Elias froze, blending into the shadows of a large support pillar. He slowed his breathing, a technique mastered by the operatives who had waited in the hallways of the Rotana Hotel. 2 men walked into his green field of vision. They were not wearing fatigues. They wore construction gear, hard hats with headlamps. They were speaking Farsi, Iranian engineers. The structural integrity at Sector 4 is compromising the expansion, one said, his voice bouncing off the stone. We need more reinforcement before we can bring the heavy transport through. The commander wants it open by the end of the month, the other replied. Reinforce it with steel. Don't worry about the aesthetics. They passed within 5 feet of Elias. He could smell their sweat and the cheap tobacco smoke clinging to their clothes. He didn't move. He became part of the stone. This was the intelligence gold mine, the timeline. End of the month. Israel didn't have months. They barely had weeks. Elias waited until their footsteps faded. He had to make a choice. Go back and upload the data, or push forward to Sector 4, the weak point they had just mentioned. If he could map the structural weakness, the IDF engineers could design a targeted kinetic pulse to collapse it from the surface, or Elias could rig it from below. He chose the risk. He moved deeper. Sector 4 was a kilometer further north. As Elias approached, the architecture changed. The Roman stone gave way to natural limestone fissures that had been roughly hewn by hand tools, likely during the Ottoman period. The ceiling here was lower, the air more stifling. He saw what the Iranian engineers were worried about. The rock here was fractured, held up by modern hydraulic jacks and steel beams. It was a scar in the earth, unstable and dangerous. This was the glass ceiling of the tunnel network. Elias pulled out his specialized equipment, a set of seismic resonance sensors. These weren't explosives. They were listening devices that could also emit high-frequency vibrations. If he placed them correctly on the fault lines of the rock, they could act as a beacon for a surface-based device, or, if overloaded, create a localized resonance frequency that would shatter the rock structure like a wine glass sung to the breaking point. He worked quickly, his hands steady. He placed the first sensor in a deep crack behind a steel beam. He placed the second near the tunnel floor. Suddenly, the lights flickered. The LED strips on the ceiling buzzed to life, flooding the tunnel with harsh, white light. Elias barely had time to dive behind a stack of timber. The tunnel was no longer a dark ruin. It was a bright, exposed corridor. Voices erupted from the direction he had come, shouting, "The winch!" They had found the winch. "Security alert! Sector 2, breach at the ventilation shaft." Elias checked his exit route. Blocked. The Iranians were behind him. Ahead of him lay the unknown depths of the tunnel leading toward Israel. He was trapped underground, illuminated, with a hostile force closing in. He looked at the seismic sensors he had just planted. They were his mission, but they might also be his only weapon. He pulled out his control unit. He couldn't collapse the tunnel now. He would bury himself, but he could create a distraction. He tweaked the frequency on the sensors. He didn't set them to collapse. He set them to screech. He pressed the button. A high-pitched, ear-splitting whine filled the tunnel, echoing off the stone walls, amplified by the acoustics of the enclosed space. It sounded like a banshee, a mechanical scream that was disorienting and painful. The shouting behind him turned to confusion. The engineers and guards covered their ears, stumbling. Elias didn't wait. He broke cover and ran. Not back toward the exit, but forward, deeper into the tunnel, toward the border. He knew from his historical research that the Romans never built a tunnel with only one way in. There had to be an outlet, a drainage point, or a connection to the cisterns on the other side. He was running a race against geology and gunmen, sprinting toward the enemy line, hoping that history had left a back door open. Running in a tunnel is a psychological nightmare. The walls seem to close in. The sound of your own breathing is deafening. Elias was fit, but the air here was thin, heavy with dust. He checked the distance on his wrist monitor. He was crossing directly under the border fence now. Above him, IDF patrols were driving armored jeeps, oblivious to the man sprinting beneath their wheels. The tunnel began to narrow. The electric lights ended. He was back in the darkness, reliant on his night vision. The smooth floor became uneven rubble. This part of the network hadn't been renovated yet. It was wild, ancient. He reached a dead end. A wall of collapsed rubble and earth blocked the path. Elias cursed silently. He scanned the obstruction. It wasn't a total collapse. It was an intentional blockage, likely created centuries ago to stop water flow or invaders. He could feel a draft coming from the top of the pile. Air was moving. He began to climb the rubble, his gloves tearing on the sharp rocks. He squeezed into the gap at the top. It was tight. tighter than the entry shaft. He had to exhale to fit his chest through the opening. He pushed through, scraping his skin, fighting the claustrophobia that panic tried to inject into his veins. He emerged into a cavernous space. He stood up and scanned the room. It wasn't a tunnel. It was a reservoir. A massive underground cistern carved out of the bedrock. The water was gone, leaving only silt and silence. And in the center of the cistern, illuminated by a single shaft of moonlight coming from a grate high above, was a ladder. A modern steel ladder. Elias approached it cautiously. He climbed up, reaching the grate. He peered through the bars. He was looking up at the underside of a concrete structure. He heard the hum of a generator. He smelled diesel. He wasn't in the wild. He was inside a kibbutz, or an outpost. He pushed on the grate. Locked. He was inside Israel, but he was still trapped underground, and behind him the sound of the screeching sensors had stopped. The pursuit would resume. He took out his encrypted phone. He had signal. He tapped a single emergency code. Shibboleth. It was the code for asset in distress, friendly territory. Extraction required immediately. He waited. 10 seconds. 20. His phone vibrated. A text message. Hold position. Vectoring. Elias sat at the top of the ladder, looking down into the dark cistern. He had mapped the network. He had planted the seeds of its destruction. But now he had to survive the waiting game. Down in the tunnel, he saw beams of light cutting through the darkness. They had cleared the rubble. They were coming through. Elias pulled a flashbang grenade from his belt, his only defensive tool. He wasn't a killer today. He was a stopper. The first head popped through the rubble gap. A fighter with a headlamp. Elias didn't throw the grenade. He dropped it. Bang! The blinding flash and the concussive boom in the enclosed space were devastating. The fighter fell back screaming. The dust cloud billowed up, creating an opaque wall. Elias grabbed the grate above him and shook it violently. "Open!" he hissed at the sky. "Open the damn door!" The metal grate rattled, the sound harsh and violent against the stillness of the cistern. Below, the dust cloud from the flashbang was beginning to settle, swirling in the beams of the Hezbollah fighters' headlamps like a nebula of angry ghosts. Elias gripped the cold steel bars, his knuckles white, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He could hear coughing down in the dark, the guttural, hacking coughs of men disoriented by the concussive blast. They would recover quickly. They always did. Suddenly the lock on the grate hissed. It wasn't a key, it was a hydraulic cutter. The metal groaned and swung upward. Hands grabbed Elias, strong, gloved hands. They didn't ask if he was okay. They simply hauled him up with the efficiency of moving cargo. He tumbled onto a concrete floor, the cool night air of the Galilee rushing into his lungs, tasting of pine needles and damp soil. He was inside a pumping station. The hum of the generator he had heard earlier was deafening here. 3 men stood over him. They wore dark, unmarked tactical gear, their faces covered by balaclavas. They carried suppressed Taver assault rifles, the weapons held low but ready. These were not local police. These were Kedon, the tip of the spear, the subunit of Caesarea responsible for the most extreme interventions. "Move," the lead operative whispered, his voice distorted by a throat mic. One of the operatives dropped a specialized incendiary device through the open grate, a thermite canister designed to burn hot and fast, consuming the oxygen in the shaft below and creating a wall of heat that would deter pursuit without collapsing the entire structure yet. They slammed the grate shut and welded it in 3 seconds with a portable tactical torch. They hustled Elias out of the pumping station and into the back of a waiting commercial van. The exterior of the van read Galilee Irrigation Systems. It was the perfect camouflage for the region, where agricultural maintenance vehicles were part of the landscape, invisible through ubiquity. As the van sped away, lurching over the dirt tracks of the kibbutz perimeter, Elias slumped against the wall. He began to strip off his coveralls, revealing the civilian clothes underneath. He checked his pockets. The drive, the encrypted drive with the 3D maps of the tunnel network, was still there. "Status?" the driver asked, not looking back. "They are close," Elias rasped, drinking water from a bottle handed to him. "Iranians, engineers, they aren't just exploring. They're reinforcing. The tunnel is viable. They have power, fiber optics, and they've bypassed the collapses. The team leader in the passenger seat tapped his earpiece. Control, we have the package. The asset is burned. Repeat, the asset is burned. The tunnel is confirmed active. We need to initiate the containment protocol. Elias looked out the tinted window. They were passing the lights of a sleeping kibbutz. Children were sleeping in those houses. Families were dreaming, oblivious to the fact that less than a kilometer away, beneath their feet, men were carving a highway intended to bring war into their living rooms. The proximity of the threat made Elias's hands shake, not from fear, but from a sudden, overwhelming rage. They were talking about a timeline, Elias said, his voice steadying. End of the month. They want to move heavy transport. The team leader turned, his eyes visible through the mask. End of the month? Intelligence estimated 6 months. The intelligence was wrong, Elias replied. They found the Roman arches. They didn't have to dig. They just had to clear the debris. The ancients did the work for them. The van merged onto the highway, heading south toward Tel Aviv. Elias closed his eyes, but he couldn't sleep. He could still hear the screech of the seismic sensors he had left behind, a digital scream echoing in the dark. He hoped they were still transmitting. Those sensors were no longer just listening devices. They were the targeting beacons for what was to come. The debriefing room at the Kiryat, the IDF headquarters in Tel Aviv, was sterile, cold, and smelled faintly of ozone and espresso. It was a room where wars were simulated and prevented. Elias sat at a glass table, cleaned up but exhausted. Across from him sat the director of operations, the head of military intelligence, Ayman, and Yael, the geological analyst who had first heard the anomaly. On the large wall screen, the data from Elias's drive was being rendered in real time. It was a terrifyingly beautiful image. The laser scan created a ghostly, neon blue wireframe of the earth beneath the border. The tunnels of the ancients snaked through the bedrock like a vascular system, bypassing the concrete subterranean barriers Israel had spent billions constructing. Here, Elias said, using a laser pointer to highlight the section he had identified as the glass ceiling. Sector 4. This is where the geology changes. The limestone is fractured. The Iranians have propped it up with hydraulic jacks and steel beams. It's holding, but barely. Yael leaned forward, studying the geological density readings. It's a fault line, she murmured, a localized stress point. If that ceiling comes down, it takes the whole sector with it. It would block the tunnel for a kilometer. So we bomb it? The head of Ayman asked. A bunker buster on that coordinate? No, the director of operations cut in. We drop a bunker buster and we announce to the world that we violated the ceasefire. We trigger a retaliation from Hezbollah. Rockets rain on Haifa by noon. We need this tunnel closed, but we need it to look like an accident. We need plausible deniability. Plausible deniability. The currency of intelligence. Just as the death of the Hamas commander in Dubai was initially meant to look like natural causes, and the death of the scientist on the train to Rome was engineered to look like cardiac arrest, this tunnel collapse had to look like geology, not war. The sensors I planted, Elias said. They are resonant emitters. I set them to screech to escape, but they have a secondary mode. They can harmonize. Harmonize? The director asked. The concept is acoustic resonance, Elias explained, his background as Dr. Macris, the hydrologist, blending with his operational knowledge. Every structure has a natural frequency, a bridge, a building, a rock formation. If you hit that frequency with enough energy, the structure vibrates. If you sustain it, it shatters. Yael's eyes widened. The glass ceiling, it's already under stress. If we introduce a specific low-frequency vibration into the bedrock from the surface, something that matches the resonant frequency of the fracture, we don't need explosives. The rock will shake itself apart, the hydraulic jacks will slip, the roof will come down. And to the seismographs in Beirut? The head of Amman asked. It will look like a microquake, Yael said, typing furiously on her laptop. A localized tectonic shift, a natural event triggered by their own digging. We can blame their engineering. We can say they dug too deep and the mountain collapsed on them. The director stared at the wireframe map. It was elegant. It was silent. It was clean. Operation Silent Quake, the director said. How do we generate that kind of frequency from the surface without being seen? Elias pointed to the map again, to the Israeli side of the border. Agriculture. We bring in the thumpers, the seismic vibrator trucks used for oil exploration. We disguise them as water drilling rigs. We park them right on top of the fault line, on our side of the fence. We drive the frequency down through the rock. We turn the earth into a weapon, the director mused. There is one problem, Elias added quietly. For the resonance to work, we need a feedback loop. We need the sensors inside the tunnel to be active to tune the frequency in real time. If the Iranians find them and destroy them, we're flying blind. Then we have to do it tonight, the director said, standing up. Before they sweep the tunnel. Before they find your toys. The logistical mobilization was a masterpiece of covert deployment. By sunset, 3 massive trucks were rolling toward the northern border. To any observer, they looked like heavy-duty water well drilling rigs, common sights in the arid landscapes of the region. They were painted with the logos of a civilian infrastructure contractor. Inside the trucks, however, there were no drills. The beds of the trucks carried massive hydraulic plates, vibro-size units. These devices are typically used by geologists to send sound waves deep into the earth to map oil fields. Today, they were being weaponized. Elias was in the command vehicle, a converted van parked on a hill overlooking the operation zone. He wasn't supposed to be there. Standard protocol dictated he should be in debriefing or on a plane to a safe house in Europe. But he insisted. He knew the tunnel. He knew the sensors. Sensors 1 and 2 are live, the technician next to him reported. Battery levels at 80%. They are transmitting a steady baseline. They haven't found them yet, Elias noted. The flashbang must have spooked them enough to pull back and wait for a security team. They're cautious. Down in the valley, the 3 trucks positioned themselves in a triangle formation, directly over the coordinates Yael had calculated. The hydraulic plates lowered, pressing against the hard-packed earth with tons of pressure. Coupling achieved, the field commander radioed. Ready for frequency injection. The plan was delicate. They couldn't just blast the earth with noise. That would be felt by the residents of the nearby kibbutz and picked up by UN peacekeepers' sensors. They had to start low, a sub-audible hum, and slowly ramp up the frequency until it matched the exact harmonic pitch of the limestone fracture 300 feet below. Initiate Phase 1, Elias ordered. The trucks began to vibrate. It wasn't a sound you could hear with your ears. It was a sensation you felt in your teeth. A low, throbbing hum that traveled through the chassis of the command van. On the screen, the data from the sensors in the tunnel began to spike. The rock was responding. It was singing back. Frequency match at 14 hertz, the technician said. The rock is absorbing the energy. Increase amplitude, Elias said. Push it. Chapter 10, The Glass Breaker. 300 feet below, inside the tunnel, the silence was heavy. The Iranian engineers and the Hezbollah security team had returned, wary and armed. They were sweeping the sector where Elias had been, looking for the intruder. The lead engineer, a man named Farhad, stopped. He placed his hand on the steel beam supporting the fractured ceiling. "Do you feel that?" he asked. The guard next to him shook his head. "I hear nothing." "Not here," Farhad snapped. "Feel." The steel was vibrating. A faint insect-like buzzing that seemed to come from inside the metal itself. Farhad looked up at the jagged limestone cracks above the hydraulic jacks. Dust was beginning to trickle down, a fine white powder falling like snow. "Evacuate," Farhad whispered. Then he screamed it. "Evacuate! It's unstable!" Above ground, in the command van, the tension was palpable. The readout showed the resonance building. The wave patterns on the screen were growing chaotic, jagged peaks of energy that indicated the rock was losing its structural cohesion. "We are at critical mass," the technician said, his voice rising. "The feedback loop is screaming. The sensors are registering microfractures." "Hold it there," Elias commanded. "Let the energy build. Make it ring." They held the frequency for 30 agonizing seconds. The ground beneath the trucks was churning, the soil liquefying from the intense vibration. "Now," Elias said, "drop the hammer." The technician slammed a sequence of keys. The trucks shifted their output, delivering a single synchronized pulse of high-energy kinetic force, a thump that hit the pre-weakened vibrating rock like a sledgehammer hitting a glass pane. Chapter 11. The swallow below, the world ended. The vibration in the steel beam turned into a violent shudder. The hydraulic jack, overwhelmed by the shifting load, groaned and buckled. Farhad, running toward the south exit, looked back just once. He saw the glass ceiling, tons of ancient limestone, detach from the earth. It didn't fall like a single rock. It flowed. The ceiling disintegrated into a cascade of boulders and earth, roaring down with the force of an avalanche. The air pressure wave hit the running men before the rocks did, knocking them off their feet. The lights were crushed, plunging the tunnel into absolute darkness. The sound was deafening, a grinding, tearing roar that sounded like the earth itself was in pain. The collapse chased them. It filled the cavernous space, crushing the crates of missiles, flattening the drilling equipment, and sealing the ancient Roman archway forever. The highway was gone. In its place was a solid wall of geology. Above ground, the team in the van felt a sudden jolt, followed by a settling sensation. "Sensor signal lost," the technician said. "Sensor 1 is gone. Sensor 2 is gone." Yael looked at her seismic monitor. Signature confirmed. Massive localized collapse in Sector 4. The void has been filled. "Did we breach the surface?" the director asked over the comms. "Negative," Yael replied. The collapse was contained deep underground. On the surface, it would have felt like a heavy truck passing by. Maybe a magnitude 2.0 tremor. Elias let out a breath he didn't know he was holding. He leaned back in the chair, watching the flat lines on the screen where the tunnel data used to be. "It's done," he said. "The ancients can sleep again." Chapter 12. The silent aftermath. The next morning, the sun rose over the border ridge as if nothing had happened. The birds sang in the olive groves. The UN peacekeepers patrolled the blue line in their white vehicles, logging a quiet night. But on the other side of the border there was panic. Hezbollah communications were chaotic, encrypted bursts of confusion. They were reporting a catastrophic engineering failure. They were blaming the Iranian contractors for using inferior steel. They were blaming the soft rock. They suspected nothing of the water drilling trucks that had been parked kilometers away. The narrative took hold quickly. It was an accident, a tragedy of ambition. The tunnel was deemed cursed, structurally unsound, and abandoned. The millions of dollars of investment, the months of labor, the strategic surprise, all buried under 1,000,000 tons of rock. Elias sat in a cafe in Tel Aviv 2 days later, reading a newspaper. There was a small article on page 6 about a minor earthquake in southern Lebanon that had damaged some agricultural infrastructure. No mention of tunnels, no mention of Mossad. He took a sip of his coffee. He was no longer Dr. Arios Makris. That legend had been retired, the digital footprint carefully archived or erased. He was just Elias again, a man with a quiet face and rough hands. His phone buzzed. A message from the director, a single line. "The water is still." It was the confirmation. The threat was neutralized. The operation was a success. Elias paid his bill and walked out into the busy street, blending into the crowd. He thought about the darkness underground, the weight of the stone, and the fragility of the peace that hung over the city like a thin sheet of glass. They had bought time, maybe a year, maybe 5. But in this war, time was the only victory that mattered. The tunnels were closed. But the digging would start again somewhere else. It always did. And when it did, men like Elias would be waiting to listen to the stone.